So, MetaCamp. There's something I've been looking into and researching for a little while now, and I think it's a fascinating story. It's a wonderful story. It has to do with coordination power-ups, and it gets a lot of insight into the limits of coordination under certain paradigms and how those can drastically change sometimes with relatively minor tweaks to the way that the social consensus works. So, what I'm going to tell is the story of a village called Ilahita in New Guinea in the late 19th century, all right? And so, to open our story, Western anthropologists visited the Sepik region. It's a mountainous region of New Guinea in the late 19th century, took a number of surveys, and one of the things they noticed is that essentially all the villages had a ceiling in population. They all had about the same sort of resources around them, but essentially 300 was the maximum size of these villages, and they were all organized in patrilineal clans, family members that were together, and like several of these clans would come together and they would form a village, but at a certain point, the benefits to these coordinations, these types of shared resources, shared defense, were outweighed by centripetal forces or centrifugal forces that pushed them out. And you had clans essentially deciding, fuck this, I'm leaving. And they go start their own village when there would be enough of a reason to sort of split off or fork off from the group. And a couple of the main reasons for this would be essentially like typical grievances. But one of the things that actually is kind of foreign to us now, but it's a really important part of this story, is sorcery. Sorcery essentially is death by magic. In this region, a young person that's not very, very old, that doesn't die in battle, was cursed to die that way, was killed by magic, by somebody else that was jealous or wanted their spot or something like that. And these types of allegations would always plague communities. So if anybody got a snake bite or fell off a cliff or got a disease, we would all interpret that now as essentially like the run of the, luck of the draw, not anybody's doing. In this region, among these people in the Sepik region, these types of things always led to allegations of sorcery. Who benefits from this person dying, right? If they were a respected member and they had this role in the community, who stepped into that role? If it was somebody else, this obviously led to a lot of suspicion and jealousy. And so sorcery allegations were a real problem because essentially it was always that other clan that would benefit from a death of an adult inside your clan. And so you have these 300 population ceiling villages in about 1870 when the first surveys are done of these regions. In about 1920, another anthropologist comes back and notices one of these regions, one of these villages, has scaled to 2,500 people. This is Ilahita. And they don't really know why this has happened. And it's only in about the 1960s that an anthropologist visits Ilahita with the explicit desire to try to find out what happened. Who designed whatever it is that is keeping this population at a much higher population ceiling than what appeared to be this sort of limit on the rest of the tribes, the rest of the villages. And when he started investigating, he found that there was no actual sort of inventor or father or mother of this new system that was in place. It had kind of happened by accident. And it happened essentially in a version of copy-paste errors. And the reason this is important is because what you have in this region is essentially a market for rituals. Rituals being the things that keep communities together beyond the sort of absolute subsistence requirements, right? You have mutual defense, shared resources. These are all like the lowest level on a hierarchy of needs channel. But then the rituals would actually help people sort of see themselves as a group, connect to others that didn't have, explicit clan ties and kin ties. And these things would help, with the centripetal forces holding together tribes. They also had essentially a market for rituals. Rituals were essentially thought of almost like productivity tools or apps. They were designed for things that, like fertility, for, war sort of blessings, for crop harvest, this kind of thing. And so they'd be performed, and however the tribe was doing and the clan was doing would be sort of an assessment of how good that ritual was and how well it was performed to honor whoever it was, the spirit god that was rewarding or punishing the tribe for performance of these rituals. And there's actually a market in this. So if you noticed that the tribe across the river had an amazing crop harvest and they were very fertile and had lots of healthy babies, you might think, oh, well, what are they using to get these better results than us? And you might go and do a sort of like ritual espionage and then bootstrap whatever they were using into your ritual means. So there's essentially like a fluid ritual market that is all sort of designed for the benefit of the tribe. And I think the easy thing, right, for a modern brain thinking about this is right to poo-poo what a ritual is. Because of course, dancing in a circle wearing a costume has nothing to do with whether it rains or not. I mean, we all know this. But rituals aren't about what they're about. They're about creating bonds amongst the participants in the rituals to make them feel more of a cohesive whole. And so well-designed rituals that accomplish this better actually do create group cohesion. So around this, in the late 19th century, after 1870, when Ilahita was surveyed as a 300 population village, a new threat emerged. There was a group, a tribe, several hundred miles away called the Abalan. They were a very aggressive tribe, and they were essentially conquering lots and lots of other neighboring tribes. And there was a flow of refugees from these conquered tribes into Ilahita. And these people were saying, oh my gosh, like these Abalan, they've got amazing ritual tech. They've got this thing called the tamboran, and it's incredibly effective, and they are basically steamrolling. It's like the Nazi blitzkrieg of this region over all the other tribes in the area. And so Ilahita's hearing about this, and they know it's coming for them, and it's not an instantaneous thing, but they've got enough time to sort of like react, and they decide that they need to protect themselves by fighting fire with fire. So they want to adopt the tamboran, this ritual system that they hear about the Abalan using because they think that's the only way to protect themselves. So they try to find out what the tamboran is. And they ask the refugees, what is it? What did you see? How does it work? What are the design mechanisms of it? And like a game of telephone, it got mistranscribed to the Ilahitan people. And so they adopted it, but they made several copy-paste errors in the way that it worked that were all fortuitous accidents that greatly increased the coordination power and the ability for them to scale. So there's three of these things that I want to talk about. The first is they designed a new org chart for ritual responsibilities. Before, and the way they were doing it in most of the Sepik region was rituals were owned by a clan, so they could leave with it. They could take the ritual with them if they decided to cleave off. And the people that were responsible for performing it all were inside that one clan. So, the fertility rituals would all be owned by, the Johnson clan, and they all had the specialists, and they would pass it down amongst themselves. And what they had heard was that the tamboran did essentially like cross responsibilities across clans, and that was correct. But what they didn't understand was how extensive it was, and that the Ilahitan version of this essentially made this ridiculously complex overlapping org chart where you would have essentially a cohort of responsibility for rituals all the way across the entire village to all the different clans. And so you would get together with your cohort, and you would have responsibility for a couple of different things in the ritual sort of schedule of events, and you would have to work with people that had nothing to do with your actual relatives before. So all of a sudden, you're spending time with them, and this was especially powerful for the rites of passage for the manhood rituals. They had, excuse me, rites of terror were part of this. Rites of terror are like, imagine kind of the Blair Witch Project. Imagine like everybody's crazy uncles getting together and scaring the shit out of like 12-year-olds in the woods at night, right? With various like costumes and crazy sounds and potentially like, ayahuasca, that type things. And they would essentially terrify these people together, but that bond they recognized created a loyalty amongst the people that went through these rites of terror together. And so one of the things that they were mistranslating from the tamboran that they thought the Abalan were using was to also mix up the types of people that went on these rites of terror manhood rituals together, so that it was all the way across the tribe. It's very much like the Band of Brothers phenomenon that like military participants engage in. People that are in combat together form a brotherhood, even though their backgrounds have very, very little in common. And this is essentially the same thing that's happening, because they're essentially taking it out of it being controlled inside of a clan structure, where it's only your family members that are producing these rites of passage for their own family members, and spreading it across the village. All the other rituals were like this too. They were spreading it out. People were getting to know each other and make alliances that connected themselves to other clans in a way that started to remove some of the seams between the clans that were still there in the village. The second thing they did was they got the names of the gods wrong. So, as I described earlier, the rituals would have, they would be controlled by a clan, and it would usually honor a particular, forefather. And so it would be the ghost of great-great-grandfather is the one that cares about this thing. And so when we perform this ritual, we're honoring this spirit god who is connected to this particular family, and we are the ones that are in charge of this thing. And so we're on the hook if it goes badly. We also get all the glory if it goes well, but it's portable. Also, we can leave with this. We have the ability to fork this off with us. What they thought the tamboran were doing, they heard about the gods that the tamboran were using, and they didn't realize that the names of the gods were actually tamboran clans and family members. They just thought they were generalized gods. So all of a sudden you have village level gods that are not connected to these clans. So there's a really powerful effect of this in that performing rituals, and whether they're performed correctly and to a way that everybody finds, or that the spirit god that you're honoring finds satisfactory, would have direct consequences, right, on the thing that you were performing the ritual to accomplish. When it was a world in which that was controlled by a single clan, the sorcery allegations became very problematic because they were always about, your tribe versus mine, and anytime somebody died, it was essentially like a huge blow between the clan that had the death in the family and whoever they suspected of essentially benefiting from it. When you move the god up a level to a village level god, when somebody dies, it's because we didn't do the ritual correctly. The entire clan the entire village didn't do the ritual correctly, and we pissed off this one god that didn't have anything to do with any of these factors. And so all of a sudden, those grievances, those lines of sort of fault lines between the clans were not being exacerbated or stressed when people would die unnatural deaths. So this was a huge thing for removing some of the tensions that continue to plague all the other villages. And the third thing that the refugees got wrong in describing how the Abalan Tambaran ritual process worked was they described that they had essentially a 4-stage rite of manhood. They had, like when they're 11 years old, do X. When they're 12, you do the rites of terror thing. And there's a couple of other stages like this. And they essentially just did append only with those 4 stages to their existing 2-stage process, which already took them through like 15 years old. So in Ilahita, the typical rite of passage for men to become like essentially like deciders in the tribe who could make decisions about whether to go retaliate or invade, perform acts of war, they were relatively young. They were 16-year-olds essentially when they got to that level of status within the community. When they took the Tambaran 4-stage process and they just appended it, it all of a sudden pushed that back to them being about 22 or 23 before they reached full, decisive manhood. And guess what? These are the dumbest years with the most aggressive, poor decision-making and like impulsive young male behavior. And so all of a sudden you've got a wisdom bonus over all of your neighbors and not making sort of like rash decisions to go retaliate. And so these copy-paste errors, they thought they were just trying to copy whatever the Abalan were doing, and they ended up becoming much, much more successful than the Abalan were, because they essentially were trying to protect themselves, and they made all these accidental discoveries of ways to essentially like outsource fault lines and grievance machines that were within their society up and out into these other things. And I think one of the things that are related to doubts about this is the value of rituals and storytelling is really, really, really strong. And I think that everybody in this space kind of like understands that. And we don't talk about them in the same way as you would talk about like a rain dance, but the legend of Satoshi is a big part of our lore craft, is a big part of the ritual of understanding the space and understanding the values of it. And I think we need to do more in this space because it does give us a sense of connecting to each other in a way that supercharges the sort of like mission, sort of takes away some of the grievances that might pull us apart, because essentially what these 300 person population caps indicated was that there were these kind of like fixed centrifugal forces that are present in any type of organization, right? And not to say that we can solve all of them, but when we're trying to scale up the coordination power, there's like a recognition that we have to find these centrifugal forces that are pulling us apart, and there are ways to essentially just make up shit that takes that tension out of it. And I don't know exactly how to do it, but I think lore, rituals, fun, memes, right? These are the tools for it. And I just thought this was an overall very DAO-centered kind of story, even though obviously we're separated by 150 years, have very different sort of material concerns. But I really wanted to share it with you guys at MetaCamp. I felt like it was the kinds of things that you guys would resonate with. And it's a very hopeful story that like you can accidentally slay Moloch. Thanks, everybody.
So how did that rabbit hole come about?
So I was reading a book called The Weirdest People in the World. So weird is an acronym for, Western, educated, industrialized, something, rich, and then democratic, I think. And it's basically saying like, that's a very, very new, very strange thing. And like all psychological research is done on weird populations, but that's not who is comprised of the entire world and where we've been. And it sort of dovetailed into this, and then I ended up getting the source material of this guy, Donald Tuzin, who studied them in in the 60s. And it's just, yeah, such a wild story of just like trying to figure out like, how'd you guys do this? Like, and recognizing that nobody really knew, and then they were trying to like put it together.
And it connects a lot with like even how the first religious came about, right? Like we used to only be able to know 150 people. That was it.
Yeah.
We had to come up with these fictions.
Yeah, exactly.
Like money or
Yeah.
companies or countries.
Yeah, exactly.
In order to like start organizing ourselves.
Totally.
Lies, right?
Yeah, gods and
made up stories.
absolutely, but they're powerful. They connect people, and yeah, it's so easy to like be dismissive of them because they're not like scientifically provable. But the thing that is real is the connections that they can create amongst people, and that's how to like leverage that.
The hassling on fraternities that we were talking about yesterday.
Yeah, yeah.
Julia told me, Chase, you gotta make a mistake. I didn't.
Any like canon book of like coordination stories like that, right?
I don't know.
Things that you would read to understand.
Yeah, I'd be happy to like contribute to something like that. I don't know of a ton of other ones that I know as well as that story, but like, yeah, I think like there's probably some stuff in like the Yuval Harari books, and yeah.
There's been some stuff like I've gone back and like gone through like the history of project management just because it's like when I was getting into like that isn't inherently like coordination. There was like a system there for like
Here's your
pyramid
thing.
building.
What'd you think?
Thanks.
Good story, right?
Yeah.